I'm thinking, at my age, like, why do these mean white men wearing these sheets want me to go home? I am home. Like, I don't like I don't understand.
Hello, and welcome to this amazing podcast conversation with Ally Henny. Oh, what an awesome, passionate, educated, just dynamic woman. And I'm so thankful for this conversation. We went so deep into her experience of blackness. It got really emotional sometimes. There's just so much to chew on here, so I'm really glad that you're here, and I know that you are going to really be touched by this conversation. And it's just part one. Look out for part two. Hello, Ally Henny. Welcome to the Epic Kate Show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
The first thing that I wanted to ask you is, these two words are really meaningful to my heart, and I wanted to know if they resonate with you at all. The words are reclaiming trauma. Does that
Oh,
say
yeah.
anything to you?
Yeah, reclaiming trauma. I think that for me as a Black American, what that means, what that work involves, is looking at the history of enslavement, of segregation, of even the more recent history where racism has sort of gone, I call it undercover, but it's not really undercover because Black people know what racism is. We know what it looks like. But a lot of people think that because there aren't signs up anymore that say whites only, that racism has just somehow poof magically disappeared from America, and that's not true. And so there's a lot of trauma and stuff that extends from, even though we don't have what we would call maybe the overt expressions of racism, there are things that are more covert, things like the practice of redlining, where Black people still in certain places aren't allowed, it's not in the law, but it's in practice to buy homes where the asking price for houses change depending on who is there, depending on who is asking for a home. There are lots of things, there are lots of traumatic instances that we have as Black Americans, even now in the 21st century, in the year 2022. And so reclaiming that trauma, the work of that to me is acknowledging, first of all, that the things that happen both in the past and presently, acknowledging that those things are real. Because I think that often the forces of white supremacy want to convince us that our experiences aren't real, that our pain isn't valid, that it's something that we're making up. They want us to think that we're playing the victim, or doing different things that would imply that we somehow don't aren't in touch with reality, or that we sometimes people will act like we're not in touch with reality, and that we're not able or capable of naming our own experience for what it is. And
Mm.
so the first step of that is being able to say, well, no, what I've experienced, it's real, it's true, it's something that's not just happening to me, it's happening to other people who look like me, and it is something that is connected to the history, not just of the United States, but there's a world history. There's a in the global north, particularly in Europe and the United States, but this also even it extends to other parts of the world. It extends to South America, it extends to Asia, obviously Africa, Australia. Excuse me, it's everywhere. There's not I don't know if there is a corner of the world that hasn't been touched by white supremacy,
Mm.
but it's us being able to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that reality, and place ourselves not only in the present but within history. And then the reclaiming work then comes in whenever we're able to name our truth, we're able to say what happened, and then we're able to find ways to then cope with that trauma, and then find ways to use that past trauma to forward our current liberation. To me, what that speaks of is a journey of liberation. So it's remembering our ancestors who went through enslavement. It's remembering our ancestors, not just our ancestors, even our elders. In my case, my elders. I have older aunts and uncles, my mother, my grandparents, my all my grandparents are deceased now. But in my lifetime, I knew people who went through segregation. In my lifetime, I knew people whose grandparents were enslaved. My grandfather's grandparents were enslaved. My grandfather's mother was my paternal grandfather's mother was the first person, of the first generation in our family to be free. And so, my grandfather passed away whenever I was very young, but I met him. I touched him, and he was only a generation removed from slavery. And the same, I have to do. I think it's maybe one more generation on my mom's side, because they had children young. Some of them had children young, so it might be like, two. My grandparents might, on my mother's side, might be two generations removed from slavery, but they're two generations removed from slavery because their parents were having kids at 17, 18, 19 years old.
Mm.
And so then that happened, but the span of years is still there.
Was it always a reality to you of knowing what they went through? Like, do you remember, do you have like a defining memory that kind of set the current focus of your life as it is now in motion because of the knowledge that you carried of, I touched people who touched slavery? Sorry,
So
that was very long-winded and terribly phrased. I told you I was a
no,
professional.
no, that's a great question. I love that question. So something that I always say is that I have always been aware of the fact that I'm Black. Like, there's never been, I cannot remember, I don't have any memories of not being Black. And you might say to yourself, well, of course, like, you don't, you're a Black person, like, you were born. Yes, but what I mean is that I don't have any memories of not being Black. A lot of Black people don't realize that they're Black. And what I mean by that is that they don't experience that thing that tells them that there's a difference. Some of us don't experience that, maybe until we get into grade school, but sometimes it can be, for some it can be even longer. And it's not that they don't recognize that their skin is different, it's that they haven't had the experiences to know that, like, Black people are treated differently, have experienced different things. The N word was one of the first words that I learned how to read. My mom says I didn't had no awareness of how old I was, but my mom says that I started reading at 3.5 years old. We would travel. My dad was in the Air Force, and he was stationed. I'm from Missouri, which is in the middle part of the United States, for those of you who don't know. And then my dad was stationed in Arkansas, which was still in the middle part, but in like the southern middle part of the United States. And so he was in the Air Force, and we would travel. It was I can't remember how long of a drive it was. It's probably 5-6 hours, probably longer than that. Drive. We would drive every weekend to where my dad was stationed, and my mom would teach me different words as we were going. So, like, I could read McDonald's. There was a city name that I learned how to read, that I was reading at 3.5. So there were all these, and I knew like little words like stop and go and see. I also knew the word home, because there was a television show called The Home Show on TV. And so I would see that word home and knew what that word meant. Well, whenever I was probably in preschool, I'm not sure how old I was. I was no older than 5. I know that much. And so somewhere between whenever I was 3.5 years old and 5, I was watching the Sally Jesse Raphael show, I think it was, with some family members at my grandmother's house, and the Klan was on there. And at that point, I had no concept really of what the Klan was. But this was sort of a thing. It might not have been Sally. It could have been Geraldo. It could have been any one of those shows. It could have been Donahue. It could have been Oprah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which show it was. But the Klan was on there, and that was sort of a thing. And talk shows in the late '80s and the early '90s was to have the Klan on there and them spouting their hate and all this stuff. And so they had a segment where they were showing some of the different paraphernalia and stuff that these Klan members have. And I remember looking at the TV, and I knew the word go and I knew the word home. And I remember seeing this thing. It's like, I don't know if it was like a lighter or like a sticker or placard. I'm not really sure what it was. It was rectangular shape, had a blue background, white words, had the Confederate flag on it. And there was this word on it that said some word, go home. And as I'm looking at this, my aunt is like looking at the screen. She's outraged. She's like, oh my gosh, that says nigger go home. And so that word, I was like, that's what that word is. And I could recognize it then on different things that because back then, I guess apparently they would just show the N word on TV, with no editing, no anything. And they would show pictures and stuff of the Klan, and I would see that word on the different signs and on the different things that they had. And so somewhere between age 3.5 and 5 years old, I learned how to read that word. So there wasn't any time in my life really, in my cognizant life that I would, and I knew, and I guess I should go back and say that I knew the N word. I knew that was me. I knew that I connected that to my blackness. As I'm watching the show, I knew from the show that these people didn't like black people. And I knew what that word, was. I knew what that word meant. And then I'm thinking, at my age, like, why do these mean white men wearing these sheets want me to go home? I am home. Like, I don't I don't understand.
How did that word make you feel?
At that specific time, I was very confused. I was confused, but I was confused by why that word, because the context that I had always heard the word in was different, was a little bit different. It was, I won't say like necessarily like a term of endearment, but there is usage of that term, maybe pronounced a little bit differently, but in the Black community, there is a usage of that word. So I had some sort of concept of that. But we talk about like the A pronunciation versus the hard R, the ER, the word ending in A versus the word ending in ER. But I had some concept of what that was. But then also, through media and stuff, I knew that word was pejorative. I knew the difference. Even at that young age, I knew the difference between somebody using it to describe another Black person, using it to use, I shouldn't say to describe, but another Black person using it in reference to another Black person. I knew the difference between that and a white person saying it. And so then the confusing part then comes in, is they just, these men are on TV, and there were probably some women too, but I remember the men specifically. But these men on TV are angry, and that word is associated with these men who are angry. And the adults who are watching the show, are just the adults who are watching the show with me, these Black adults, my family who are watching the show with me, are just flabbergasted and outraged by this being on television. And they're watching it and they're like, oh my gosh, these people, this is awful, this is horrible. And so just within that, the messaging for me, the confusing part was, why do these people want me to go home? I am home. I'm at home. What does that mean? Go home. You pick up on connotation and you realize, like, that's kind of mean, like that, like these people are mean, these people are angry. I guess that's like a moment, um that's perhaps the moment, maybe the defining moment, um the defining moment that but I say that's a defining moment, but there was messaging that I had, programming that I had before that cognizant moment. That
Mm.
was more of a moment of different things crystallizing for me, different ideas crystallizing. And then probably not very long after that, um, maybe, a year or two after that, maybe longer, because I guess I would have been, because I would have been in kindergarten. So sometime after all of that had happened, um, I watched the miniseries Roots, for the first time, which is, I was in kindergarten.
Dang, that's some heavy
First
stuff for a 5-year-old.
Yeah, I was 6 in kindergarten,
Ooh.
and yeah, and so that was just something. It was on TV because Alex Haley, who is the author of the book that inspired the miniseries, Alex Haley had just passed away, and so they were showing Roots on, I think it was like the Family Channel, and my mom recorded it, videotaped it off of the Family Channel. My parents watched it. I remember watching it. I didn't understand all of everything that was happening, but that was maybe the first time that I encountered the concept of slavery. And remembering, like the part that always kind of stood out to me was, Kunta Kinte getting his foot chopped off, getting part of his foot chopped off for trying to run away. And so that scene always stuck out to me, because it was like why is he getting his foot chopped off? My mom, like, you explaining like what was happening. And so as I grew, I gained more of a concept of that. But I remember watching that show, and of course I'm seeing people who look like me, I'm seeing white people using that word. There are things that I was starting to get and to understand. And so then, that prepared me for the first time that I was called the N word, which was whenever I was 7 years old in first grade. Um, there was a boy that we were, as far as I knew, we were friends. Now, I grew up in a small rural town, in West Central Missouri, and I I was at an after school program, and this boy that I was friends with, he would catch the bus to the first grade school from the main elementary school. And so we would sit there together, and we would talk and play, and just had fun. We were also in the after school program together. And so we were like as far as I knew, we were friends, like we liked each other. It was whatever. Well, I remember we were waiting in line, to use the bathroom, and I don't remember what we were talking about, why we even got on the subject of dancing. But we were talking about dancing. It was me, him, and another little girl were talking about dancing. And so I started dancing. I started probably like doing some combination of like, the Roger Rabbit and the Running Man or whatever, because I mean this is 1992, of course. And so I'm like, whatever. And so he's like, I don't mean none of that nigger crap. And I was like, oh. And so I was just so I, it just it because I knew what that word meant, and I knew that it was a bad word, and I knew it was wrong, and I knew that it was something that I should not be called. And so I remember just stopping, and I went and told the teacher, and I was like, this is what, like he said this to me. And it took me, because I mean I didn't even really want to say the word. I was like, he called me an in-er. And the teacher's like, what? I was like, and so I was like, he called me a nigger. And so she's like, oh, okay. So she goes and says something to him, like, it was sort of like, now we don't call people names like that. It was sort of like whatever. And so, he got the finger wag, now treatment. But I knew, from that point on, we weren't cool like that anymore. Like, I like, we still rode the same bus, we still whatever. but I knew, but it changed our relationship. It changed our friendship. I wasn't friends with him anymore after that. All that to say that, there are these, for me, a singular moment. It wasn't a singular thing that happened, and some people do have that. They do have that moment where somebody calls them a word and they're like, I have no idea what this word means, and they go home to their parents and they tell their parents, this kid called me this, I knew it was mean, but I don't know what it is. And they have that moment, and the parents, have to explain to them. This often happens to Black kids who grew up in kind of suburban environments, where their parents, left the big bad city to go and think that for opportunity, but they're leaving, like, the big bad city to go to give their kids opportunities, and then they realize that, white people in the suburbs are racist. And and so, some people kind of, come up with like these colorblind sort of mentalities, and they don't equip their kids, and there's no condemnation on anybody at all, but some people don't equip their children to be able to have these experiences. I had been equipped I had been equipped by my family, um to know that these things were wrong, to know that white people didn't always treat us well. Growing up in a small rural town, I was equipped for the inevitable experience of discrimination.
You talked about your family. How were you taught to look at your cultural identity?
That's a great question. I was taught to look at my cultural identity with a tremendous amount of pride, with a tremendous amount of love, of admiration, of care, of respect, of dignity. That's how my family was. I mean, I grew up I grew up in a Black home. Like, we were Black people. I have several cousins, several relations, myself even, who have married interracially, in subsequent generations, and there have been white people who, as far as my existence has gone, there are white people who kind of have always been part of my family existence, but like, it was a Black family. We went to a Black church. The street that my grandmother lived on, it was Black people all around us. Now, of course, that was because of segregation. At one point, that was existing, that existed in my small town. But that was my community. But so a lot of my experience, a lot of my friends, my peers and stuff that I had, were white, but I knew I was different from them, and there wasn't. I never felt like. I think that too much to my mom and the rest of my family's credit, I never had a sense of like, I have to be like them, or I have to try to assimilate, or I have to try to. I think that there were some of those messages there for sure, but it was more of a. I always kind of took it as a, this is how you survive. This is how because people, if people will discredit you if you have this type of behavior. If you come into this situation acting like this, people are going to discredit you. They're not going to give you opportunities. So you need to show them that you're smart. You need to show them that you're capable of doing this. You need to show them that you know how to act, like all this other type of stuff. But that was less about assimilation. That was less about trying to blend in with white people, and more about, we want you to have a future. We want you to have a life and a future. I think that my family understood the school to prison pipeline. We didn't have the language for that, and so
Mm.
they wanted, all of us in my family to all of my cousins, and my older sister and everything. They wanted to set us on a trajectory that would keep us out of the white man's system, that would hurt us, that would condemn us, that would punish us, that would steal our futures and stuff.
So
And
so that was a part of your being raised and part of acknowledging a culture identity is, in order to make it, you have to not be an angry Black woman. You have to be the calmest person. You have to be
Mhm.
the most well-spoken person. Like, this was just these high standards.
Yeah, you have to be twice as good to get half as much. So you have to you have to you can't drop a stitch. Like you have to, in order to succeed, in order to have the potential to be able to get out of here, if you would choose. And my sister and I are the only ones who have chosen to leave our small town. I should say the only ones, but about the only ones, of my cousins and my family of my generation, that have not chosen, small town Missouri life. My sister lives in Pittsburgh, and I live in Chicago, and we we were that was what we were taught, but we were not taught it from the angle of be like them. Some Black people are taught that, and they're taught to be like white people. We weren't we I wasn't taught any of that. I was my mom I have I've had the pleasure of being able to pass down, a lot of the books and stuff that my mom bought for me as a kid, to my own children. And my mom made a point of, as a Black parent in the 90s, in the late 80s and 90s, to buy any and every book that had Black, it seems like any and every book that had Black people in it, Black people doing something, whatever. She bought that. It was there. If there was Black shows on TV, my family watched them. We watched Family Matters. We
Oh,
watched Fresh Prince. We watched Roots. We watched whatever was on TV. That whatever was on TV and was Black, we watched that. I mean, I remember growing up, Michael Jackson didn't do anything that wasn't like an event in my house. That it wasn't like a major event. There wasn't anything going on that had to do with Black folks that we weren't right there in front of the television, because the television, for being rural, and especially in a society that didn't have internet, the TV was our way out. That was our window to the world. We weren't from the city. We couldn't just go, and we a lot of us worked. A lot of my family worked in Kansas City and everything, but we couldn't just, like, go someplace in the city and go and be part of something. And even during the 90s, Kansas City was the closest city. During the 90s, Kansas City was very dangerous. So even some of the places that we could have gone to get culture were just dangerous, or there was the perception that there could be danger. In What's it called, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who grew up in New York, he talks about how, growing up in New York City, how TV, different things for him, he referred to them as like dispatches from this like white suburban world. And because the world that he was growing up he came of age in the 80s and 90s. The world that he was growing up in New York, in the midst of the crack epidemic and all of that, was a much different world than what was on TV. Now, the crack epidemic actually hit my small town too, but that's a whole other different story. And ravaged the Black community in my town, ravaged a generation of Black men in my town. So the men who are my father's age, my father, excuse me, my parents divorced, whenever I was 7. So my dad was not part of that. My dad was military. He wasn't in that category. But all the men his age, all the men, one of my uncles' age, there's hardly a one of them that were not touched, by crack
would
cocaine.
this be like people kind of born in like the 60s, end of 50s,
50s,
60s?
mid to late 50s, early 60s, with that generation. So younger baby boomers, early Gen
I was
Xers.
figuring we are about the same age because you said you were 92, you were like 7. I was like, wait, that sounds familiar. Are you an 86 kid?
I'm an 85 kid. Yeah.
85, yeah. But I wanted to go back um to the previous generations and the hardship they carried. I'm sure you've heard this, and there's coming to be more and more scientific proof of this, that we carry the trauma in our genes. We pass it on. Like, our kids carry the fears of snakes that they've never met in their bones because of trauma. And I wanted to kind of relate that to the whole thing I messaged you about, and originally was the response to the Queen's death. And how dare people celebrate her death? She was a person. I saw that video of yours, and just the tone policing and not taking into consideration the trauma that colonization has for people.
What white people, and I'll speak specifically about white Americans, but I feel like that this is that this is actually, I can universalize this even to Europeans to some extent. But what white Americans often fail to understand is that being what we would call in America a person of color. So that encompasses not only Black American people like myself, but that encompasses Indigenous Americans, that encompasses people who are Latin American, that encompasses Asians, people of Asian descent. It encompasses basically everybody who isn't a white European, or who isn't of white European descent. And we tend to navigate the world in a much more communal sense as opposed to individualistic. White American culture is very individualistic. Even as we have, because certain people sometimes from the coast will argue with me, well, but they're ethnic enclaves. I'm an Italian American, I'm a German American, I'm an Irish American, blah 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 blah. And yeah, that's true. And probably for our generation's grandparents, or even our generation's great grandparents, there were a lot of ethnic lines drawn, and it would be kind of weird, for a German person to marry an Italian person, or a German person to marry an Irish person. But then through history, whiteness kind of erased, and at least in America, kind of erased some of those distinctions. I know that in Europe, you're able to have more of those nationalistic kinds of distinctions, because you're in Europe. But in America, white people whose skin is your color or thereabouts, all just kind of got lumped together. Like after generations, you couldn't look at somebody and be like, oh, that person's Irish, or oh, that person's English. I mean, you could maybe take a guess. Like, I mean, people have different looks and stuff about them still. You can maybe guess what their ancestry is, but those differences stopped making a difference. And I shouldn't even say they stopped making a difference. Those differences, because there were a lot more of us Black people and Irish people and German people and French people together. There were a lot more of us than there were the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so those people in our history, had to consolidate their power. And so they used skin color in order to consolidate power. And so they use skin color. So it's not something that was just like, oh, all of a sudden one day white people just consolidated. That's not it. It was a crafted move. It was a move that was crafted by the white social elites, who realized that, well, if we piss all these Black people off and all these Irish people off, they can revolt, because they did, and unseat us. If these groups of people work together, they could take all of our land and all of our stuff, because it's only a little bit of us. And so they had to turn the Irish people, they had turned them against Black people. They had to say, well, hey, we're, we kind of look the same. So but those people over there, they're inferior with their hair and their dark skin color, and I'm not even sure if they're human. And so it was a crafted thing. So I don't want to talk about it like it was accidental. It was crafted. And as different immigrant groups came into America through different waves of immigration in American history, immigrants from Europe, and even there's a case, I can never think of the guy's name, but there's actually a Supreme Court case where a Japanese guy tried to be declared by the court as a white person. because he looked at his skin and he said, like, yo, but my skin is like, it's like your skin color. So I shouldn't have to experience segregation because like I'm white like y'all. And the Supreme Court was like, no, 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 we can't do that. Like we can't let Japanese people be white because you're not.
You're
So
not one of us. Have you seen
you're
your
not
eye?
one of us. We have prejudices against you that is not advantageous for us to overlook. So you can't be one of us. But throughout American history, different European immigrant groups came to America and kind of nudged up and was like, hey, we want to be white. Yeah, can we be white? And the people who were deemed white were kind of like, okay, yes, it's advantageous for us to it's hard to discriminate against you because you look a lot like us. So it's going to be harder to discriminate against you. So okay, so that's just a little bit of a very raw version of American history here.
But so about the question, the communal mindset is what has kind of helped people to remember their oppressors and remember what's happened to them.
Yes. And so getting to that. So, white people have just been able to be individualistic and y'all just been able to move through the world individualistic. Well, you forget, a lot of times white folks forget that, and again, I'm speaking specifically toward America, but we could generalize this to other places, that there is not an ethnic group. There's not a non-European descended group that hasn't been oppressed by European descended people. And we remember those things. And so even whenever you start talking about colonization, then whenever you have people from England getting on a boat and going down to Africa and stealing the wealth of the land, those people remember that. Those people, now they don't remember because they were alive. Some of them were alive because, some of these countries didn't get free of colonization until the 1960s. So there are people alive in Africa who have experienced colonization. And so who knows what it's like to live under colonization, and who knows what it's like to then have to decolonize. And those people know how those white people treated them. They remember, they literally remember it because it's literally in the living, it's not something in a history book from 200 years ago. It is in the living memory. And if it's not in the living memory of a particular village or a particular country, they can look at their neighbors and be like, yo, these people, yeah, they treated them really bad over there in Nigeria. Like, yeah, this was awful. So then if there's something, whenever somebody does a group of people wrong for not a year, not 2 years, not 10 years, not 20 years, but over multiple centuries, that stuff runs deep. And those atrocities, the rape, not just of the people, but of the land and the pillaging of resources, that's not something that we can just say, oh, well, it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's water under the bridge. Because those people, in their communal sense and their communal identity, they are still living that. They are still telling the stories. They still have the stories of what it was like before, or they have the stories of what it was like whenever it was at its worst. So then to ask people to just to not rejoice when an oppressor is gone, and people might say, well, but the queen, but she did this and that. She was, and now King Charles is still the representative of an oppressive regime that has really in many ways only symbolically relinquished power, because the languages have suffered, the people have suffered. People like me who are not indigenous to North America and South America were stolen there were futures that were stolen, and that's a part of colonization that the colonization aspect of it that we don't often get to, is that there were people who were stolen from those lands, and then placed elsewhere, and then their wealth and their future looted from them. And so yeah, people are going to rejoice whenever the representative of that is
and
gone.
and they have the gall, the colonizers, the mentality is the gall to claim the right to have done that because of God. Oh, um and speaking of God, have you, this is a question that I'm really excited to ask you. Have you had a supernatural experience tied to connecting with the suffering of people who've gone on before you? Can you share about it?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The best experience with this, if I were to dig, if I were to think more, I would probably be able to think of a few more. But the best experience that I can think of happened. It's been probably, I guess it's been about 6 years ago now, because I didn't know it at the time, but I was pregnant with my youngest daughter, who turned 6 in January. And I was my family had just moved from Virginia, had just moved from the East Coast back to Missouri, and we were staying at my in-laws' house, and the remake of the movie Roots had come out. There's a LeVar Burton, who played Kunta Kinte in Roots, executive produced an updated version of that movie, and it came on like the History Channel and several other channels. Well, anyway, I was watching that, and the first couple of episodes, they really dug into some of the story of being of the people in Africa, and then the story of the Middle Passage. And so there's a scene in that movie when Kunta Kinte he's feeling very sick, because he's on this boat, and he throws up, and he tells, and his uncle's near him, and he says, uncle, like, all this has happened, like my food won't stay in my stomach, like I'm feeling very sick, I'm laying here like an animal, I'm so ashamed. And Kunta Kinte's uncle looks at him, and he says, the shame is not ours. And he said the shame is not ours. And so then there's another line a little bit later on. They were staging the people started staging a revolt on this ship, and they so one of the ways that they were doing this was by dancing. So they were dancing, and they were using the dancing and the chanting that they were using in the dancing during the dancing to communicate with one another plans to overtake the ship. And so one of the Kunta Kinte's uncle says to Kunta, he's like, we're going to dance so the white man isn't afraid of us. And it made me think of, all the times that contemporary Black people have to literally or figuratively dance. Like, we have to make ourselves less threatening to white people. And so as I was watching this episode about the Middle Passage and everything, there was just an overwhelming sense of grief that really overtook me. Now, some of this, it was the pregnancy hormones that I didn't know that I was having, I'm sure, but I really feel like that my physical body, what was happening in my physical body that I was completely unaware of at the time, so I couldn't, can't even be playing it up, because I was completely unaware that I was pregnant. But I think that what was going on in my physical body with the hormones and everything, it allowed me to then be able to enter into something psychologically, and I believe supernaturally, where as I'm thinking of the show, there was a part of me that broke, and I just started weeping. Like, I left after everything was over. I left after the show was over. I left the room and went into the kitchen, And I was just upset. And I think my husband could tell that there was something wrong. So he came in the kitchen. He was, like, "Are you okay?" And I just started weeping. And I was just like, "I'm here because someone chose to live. I'm here because that's my people. That's my story. I'm here because somebody didn't jump off the side of the boat. I'm here because someone somewhere, there's no condemnation on the people who jumped off the side of the boat. But I think there was dignity in them jumping off the side of the boat. I'm here because someone wasn't sick, and it wasn't just someone, it was multiple someones, hundreds of someones. Exactly, because you have your bloodline multiplies exponentially. So it was hundreds of somebodies, if not thousands of somebodies, decided on a boat while they were chained up and throwing up and sick and harmed. They somehow managed to push through that situation. They managed to push through that. They talked to themselves, they talked to their God. I don't know what they did, but I'm here because all of those people chose to live. And there was something in that for me that was very humbling, but also very sad, because also there were people who chose the sea. There were people who, rather than be on a boat, they chose the sea. And those people, their bloodline was cut off. They're gone. We don't know them. We don't know who they are. I don't have aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters because of that. And there are people on the continent that I am no longer connected to because of that. And there's something very, very grievous, very deep, and also very grievous about that.
Mm-hmm.
And what came over me in thinking of that, in remembering that, and I say remembering because it was as if I was remembering something that I did not experience. I'm not saying that I had actual memories and I saw, a vision of any of this, but there was something in me. There was something inside of me, and we know now that trauma alters your DNA. So there's something literally in my DNA that remembers that ship, that remembers not just one person on the ship, but again, hundreds and hundreds of somebody's on that ship, possibly even thousands of somebody on that ship. Somebody is on that ship, depending on how far back it goes, depending on how far back, how many people were forced to give birth and all this other type of stuff. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people who endured a lot of really bad stuff. That's a lot of altered DNA. That's a lot of yeah.
How did your husband respond to this big outpouring of emotion? Is that not the kind of thing that you would do very often?
Yeah, I mean, I've cried like that, I can count on one hand the number
So
of
he was
times.
probably taken a bit aback.
Yeah, I think for sure he was taken aback, and him being a white man, him being the descendant of German and Swiss immigrants, there might be one line of his family that I'm still trying to figure out if they were slaveholders or not. But a lot of his family, most of his family, was over in Germany and Switzerland while all this nonsense was going on. Now they probably were part of colonizing or whatever, other parts of the world. But as far as American history goes, that's not 100%, that's not fully part of his story, part of his history, as part of his family history. It's part of his history as a white American man, definitely part of his history. And so he definitely had a lot of compassion, but of course, that's not something that he will ever be able to understand. He won't ever. And we had at the time was a 2-year old, and of course, could understand it via, oh well, like I wouldn't be here, and thus like our child would not be here. He could understand it through that lens, but through the lens of a shared history, absolutely not. So I mean, there's not much consolation that one can provide without having those experiences, and having to understand. I appreciate what he was for me in that moment, and that was a shoulder to cry on, and someone who he knew well enough, because he's educated. Thankfully, over the years he's been educated enough not to pop off and say something stupid, like, or I shouldn't say stupid, that's probably not the right word to use. He knows better to not to pop off and say something ignorant at that point. But yeah, that was sort of his response.
There is more to the conversation. Next week, we'll talk about how Christianity is not the religion of the oppressors, and a lot of other fascinating historical things. And if this resonates with you, please subscribe and stick around. I would love to have you here. Bye.